My name is Evaggelos Vallianatos. I have a doctor's degree in history with a special interest in the history of science. I did my postdoctoral studies in the history of science at Harvard. I have written 7 books, hundreds of articles, and I worked for the US EPA for 25 years. And this knowledge about climate started a long, long time ago. Indeed, I have been writing almost not exclusively, but I have published a lot of articles on climate change because for the simple reason that I consider it to be the greatest threat to humanity and civilization. So here we start. Factories, I consider to be, of course, a tremendous source of pollution, and you all will agree with me. Cars is another disaster, and especially living in California, as I have been for the last 14 years. Any morning I walk my dog or I take a walk, I am surrounded by large automobiles. Probably very few of them are electric cars. And so it's a big problem for the United States and, of course, the rest of humanity because they were hooked up on this technology several decades ago. And despite the knowledge and despite the warning of the United Nations and scientists, we could keep the business as usual. China is the largest polluter on Earth in terms of climate pollution. And unfortunately, China is imitating the United States to the T. I have been to China 3 times, and I think the country has tremendous potential to lead to different ecological paths. Indeed, the Chinese have been talking about ecological civilization for quite a while, and I congratulate them for that, and I agree with that. When I go to China, I always talk about ecological civilization. In the United States, we're very much almost drunk about this technology or whatever we have, depending that is on fossil fuels. And as you can see here, the owners of this oil refinery in Houston are very patriotic, so they had to put the American flag on it too. The refining and doing these works with fossil fuels, of course, has its dangers. And in this picture, you can see a kind of a fire that broke out in Port Arthur, Texas. And Port Arthur, Texas happens to be also a community that most of the people are non-white. They suffer tremendously from pollution. And if they work, they definitely don't get what they deserve. There have been resistance to all this, of course. And in this picture, you can see a kind of effort long time ago against the drilling in the Arctic, but the movement continues. Industrialization is the main problem. I'm not against machines, but I'm against machines that rely on petroleum, natural gas, and coal. We should have known better, but we seem to be continuing lemmings to jump over the cliff. The temperature of the planet, of course, continues to be up. And in this slide, you can see the rising temperatures after 50. And for millennia, of course, the carbon emissions were about 300 parts per million. But suddenly, on the late 19th and early 20th century, now we have reached to the 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And on this picture, you can see the red part represents the greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, and so on. And this was a picture taken by NASA in 2014. Here's another picture by NASA again in 2015. It was also a very hot year. And again, the rising of the carbon dioxide has nowhere else to go but up because we are slipping on the wheel, so to speak. And meanwhile, business as usual continues. And this is a picture of coal mining in eastern Kentucky. And of course, the representative of Kentucky in the Senate, he is very happy and he says there's no climate change following the nonsense of former President Trump. And of course, most of the Republican Party continue to argue and to say that we don't have any problem with global warming. Now, the trees, of course, give us all sorts of benefits. And here in this picture, you can see the moisture that comes out of the trees. But cutting down the trees that is deforesting an area is like the exercise of genocide against human beings. And here we have ecocide. If you cut down a forest, you destroy the habitat for who knows how many creatures. Could be thousands, could be hundreds. They have to run away. And of course, who knows whether they're going to find an alternative house. It's the same thing with us. If there's a major earthquake, where can we go? In Brazil, they keep food deforesting. And of course, the last president they had, Bolsonaro, he made it his business to convert as much of the Amazon forest into plantations to grow soybeans so they can sell the soybeans to the Europeans or to the Americans in order to feed their pigs and horses and so on. He's destroying the lungs of the planet, so to speak, in order to make an extra dollar. Something we are very much accustomed to doing this in this country, of course. The clear cutting, this is a picture from Oregon. I have been to Oregon several times, especially after I wrote my book, Poison Spring. I went there to give a number of talks. This is a clear cut in the forest in Amazon, in Oregon. And you can see it's total devastation. There's no joke about that. There's nothing left after the clear cutting. And not only that, but they send helicopters and they spray so they can kill out everything that survives the mechanical devastation. Meanwhile, the forests, of course, react to rising temperatures. For instance, there's a pine beetle that thrives on rising temperatures, so it infests trees and it kills them slowly. The other effect, of course, of rising temperatures is thunderstorms. So the weather events are becoming more and more violent, and we can see them all the time. Starting with flooding. This picture shows the James River flooding in South Dakota in 2020. We have flooding here in Indonesia, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in China, in India. Here is, of course, in New Jersey and Pakistan this summer. Most of Pakistan, apparently, or at least half of the country was flooded. And the effects, of course, who knows what the people who were flooded, would they recover their property if it was a house that was flooded and so on. Here is very much personal. I live in Claremont, California, and the picture is a gigantic, over 100-year-old tree that was uprooted completely and dropped on this college building in Vermont. And this happened because we had a strong wind. So a strong wind uprooted dozens of trees like this all over Claremont. So you drive today or you walk today in Claremont, you will not see a trace that there was ever a tree like this in that area. And now the question, of course, about Claremont is, have we learned anything? No, they have not. They keep business as usual, just like nothing happened. We see a NASA picture of the Hurricane Ian covering the entire state of Florida. And this happened only a few months ago, September 29, 2022. And the destruction was phenomenal. You can see cars dropped all over, everything. This is another picture of the same disaster from the Hurricane Ian in Florida. And of course, this is another gigantic picture of destruction, again in Florida. Now we come to another effect of growing global temperatures is the melting of glaciers that keep all this gigantic amount of fresh water there for decades and centuries. The amount of fresh of glaciers is shrinking. And here in this picture on the upper part, you see what was 100 years ago, all the ice pretty much in place. And the lower picture shows you all the ice gone, melted into water. From Alaska, we have this area that you see is water, is nothing but, it used to be covered by ice, no more. The permafrost, what we call permafrost, it's a land that is almost like frozen land. But if you begin to unfreeze it, then you immediately release enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. And there's a quotation I had from a scientific article about the horrific amounts of stuff that is coming out by global warming because the soil is becoming warmer and all this stuff begins to join the atmosphere to our own regret. And the polar bear, of course, have trouble because the ice, which they supported themselves in order to go fishing, is melting and some of them are starving to death. And we also have people that are beginning to move away from intense heat, extreme heat, like in Africa. And here is a picture showing all these refugees in Mali, Africa. And of course, this is going to be a great crisis for the whole planet. The longer we wait to do anything to slow down the global warming. This is just a beautiful territory in Northern California, in contrast to the problems we have describing. A drought is another one of the other effects of growing temperature. Here is drought in southeastern United States. You can see the design and the effects from 2006 down to 2020. The longer we come, the more we come to our time, 2022, the more the red color, and therefore the more extensive drought, therefore the less water, the less rain, the more problems of raising food. River's End is just a documentary about politics, the dirty politics of water in California. The farmers of the Central Valley of California, I don't know how many of you are from California, but you need to go to the Central Valley to understand this. It's a gigantic area that used to be like paradise, and they have leveled it and they have divided into gigantic chunks of farms, and there they grow one crop in order to make whatever. And these experts, these people that made the documentary came to my class last semester. I was teaching at the university, and they talk extensively and they let us see the documentary and we talked about them. And they're very dismal in their assessment. The politics is decades old and it's very dangerous because 80% of the drinking water of the state is used by this small number of farmers who grow, among other things, walnuts and almonds, especially almonds. And each almond, remember, it's about what? Less than an inch long, demands 1 gallon of water, drinking water. And what would they produce so much of this stuff that they export? So they're exporting the diminishing amount of water of California. And yet the state of California is doing nothing to stop them. Okay, now the drinking water, of course, is we cannot do without water. In Greek philosophical times in the 7th century BCE, we had philosophers that they said, look, water is the structure, makes up everything. And in fact, the whole earth is more or less surrounded by water and it's floating on. It was done by a philosopher of the 7th century named Thales, the first natural philosopher of ancient Greece. Now, back to California, we see the effects of global warming on Lake Mead in California. And Lake Mead is one of the two largest reservoirs of water from the Colorado River. And here is the effect of global warming. Now we can see the picture on the left is from 2000 and the picture on the right is from 2021. And you can see the diminishing amount of water left in that reservoir. And finally, this is another NASA picture where you have 2000, 2021, and 2022. Compare the two, the middle and the one on the right, to see within 1 year the difference of the amount of water left in this reservoir. This is another effect of this horrific situation. Then we go to Lake Powell, which is the other large reservoir for water. We face the same problem. It's facts are there. It's just a matter that we have politicians who regrettably are not courageous enough to follow their consciousness and especially to follow the warnings from scientists and science of global warming, and they just keep business as usual. Another effect in California again, this is the lake up in Northern California, and it used to be a beautiful, vast wetland, and here is now, it's a desert. The Mount Shasta is another mountain in California, and it was without snow last winter. This is an aqueduct flowing through the desert of California. We can see the California River. This river is drying up. And we have it was a fantastic book published in 1987 called Cadillac Desert, which I use each time I teach. This is a beautiful book because this guy really spent time going through the politics of the water in California and why they do what they do, explaining the politics of the water, the misuse of water misuse in the Central Valley and so on. So for those of you who are really interested in this water question, please read this book, Cadillac Desert. This is coming from the Los Angeles Times, August 26, 2022. And this reporter is talking about the change in nature of what if you drive and you can see all these coal plants. There are rivers drying up and record crowds are packing national parks and so on. Wildfires are getting deadlier and so on and so on. But however, he's a little bit not optimistic, but he says that they work from home driving big city residents to smaller, more scenic locales. This is completely nonsense. Meanwhile, he says, of course, Joshua trees are threatened. The ocean's water is rising. Of course, he highlights in his lengthy article that the people in the desert, because of what they do, they are threatening biological diversity and especially the survival of this beautiful bird. And so we have a tremendous problem in our hands. This picture shows you the headquarters of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. I spent 25 years of my life working for this agency. When I started in 1979, I knew very little. I had a doctor's degree in history with the studies in the history of science. And I was all full of hope and that this institution, which was founded, by the way, by Richard Nixon in 1970, had good intents. And of course it did. I mean, it promoted, and we have some excellent laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other laws that were written by politicians in the early 70s. And they tried to clean up because the country was in dire situations. There was a river near was this Cleveland, Ohio, that caught fire. There was a lot of petroleum floating on the river. But the EPA, unfortunately, because of the different administrations and different politics of the Republicans versus the Democrats, they have caught the attention of the polluters, and the polluters, of course, have plenty of money, and they take all these congressmen and senators to dinner, and they bribe them indirectly, and they do their bidding, which is to, when something important comes up and the scientists of EPA say, this is what we now need to do, and the political appointee with the agency just ignores that recommendation, and they do something that feels good, and it's pretends to do something that is really not there. And one of the greatest anxieties I have had since I started working for the EPA was all about the use and misuse of these chemicals known as pesticides. The real name of those chemicals should be biocides, that is, they kill everything. They're designed to kill. And by the way, they're also petrochemicals, meaning they're made out of petroleum. So this is an additional use of the stuff that causes global warming. And what you see here are in a kind of a hot house, there's people dressed like spacecraft men, but spraying most likely fungicide to kill fungi. And of course, people are supposed to eat the stuff that they spray. The political corruption in America is very deep and goes back a couple of hundred years. But I worked at the US EPA from the Carter administration down to the mid-level career, mid part of the George W. Bush administration, and I saw a variety of Democrats and Republican presidents and how they affected the use of EPA and what the EPA did and so on. And of course, in 2014, I published my book about the EPA, which is called Poison Spring, and I hope some of you might actually read it. One of the key elements of the early 70s was the DDT. Everybody was singing, DDT is good for me. And look at this picture where young children are within the dust of this spray. Think of it, level of culture and civilization when they allow children to go through this deadly chemical. But of course, the understanding of the deadly chemical in the 70s was not what it is today. But nevertheless, they were already warned. Rachel Carson had published her book in 1962, and she was concerned about the effects of DDT, in particular on birds. Birds that came in touch with this chemical could not procreate. That is, the cell that the tiny little chick is being hatched is so fragile so that the mother bird or the father bird being over that egg, it crushes it, and therefore there's no way that a bird will actually be able to have a young. So they die. Here is another picture of spraying DDT over sheep, if you can believe it, 1948. So we're going all the way to the 40s. And of course, the people who manufactured DDT, they had a large factory of it in LA, in Los Angeles, if you can believe it. They began to dump all their waste into, guess where? Near the harbor of the Los Angeles megalopolis. And they did it at the knowledge of several agencies within California. They knew about the dumping, and yet they did nothing. A biologist from the University of California, Santa Barbara, discovered this by accident. And it was 2021. And they started now, and they found that there are several 100,000 barrels leaking, overturned, and so on, covering who knows how many square miles of the ocean floor. And you have wildlife in the ocean, seals, for instance, dolphins. If they eat fish which are exposed to this chemical, they themselves get cancer, or they cannot procreate. So a horror story. And of course, this beautiful bird, which is unique to California, the California condor, is having these problems that birds had in the 60s with DDT. That is, he cannot procreate. So the government, fortunately, they have taken enough of these birds, and they raise them away from DDT, and they give them food that is not contaminated with DDT. So there may be a hope for this bird. But when you see a person like this doing this, what hope do you? He's killing everything. That's in 2006. I wrote a book about large farmers, and I said the large farmers in the world, and indeed they do, because they spray the most. They have the largest amount of land, which has the largest amount of endangered species, which die because of what they do. They grow one crop, they spray a lot of chemicals, so it's not pleasant at all. And finally, we come to this idea of the factory farm. What is this factory farm? And these people are protesting the factory farms, and there's a reason to protest them. Factory farms are like this picture. I took this picture in the Central Valley. They have dozens, maybe hundreds, sometimes thousands of these animals very close to each other, and then they feed them. They keep eating. And of course, that's the only pleasure, because after a year or 2 years, they slaughter them. So in the process of being very close to each other, of course, they create disease. So to avoid all of them dying at the same time, they put pharmaceuticals into their food. So they eat antibiotics in addition to wheat or soybeans or whatever. And therefore, you that you love a steak, guess what you're eating? I recommend you stop eating meat. This is a picture from China. The Chinese are doing exactly what we're doing. And you can see and of course, all these animals end up in the slaughterhouse. You can see the slaughtering. And then, of course, the birds themselves, and now the animals get cancer just like we do. They have no way to go to heal themselves. And this is just a picture from a beautiful seal in an isolated corner of Greece. Now, protection of the natural world is extremely difficult. I remember when I was teaching in Northern California and at Humboldt State University, some of my students and other students were climbing up trees to protect the trees from being cut. This is dangerous stuff. And I talked to my colleagues, professors, but they themselves said, what could we do? One of the environmental groups that is doing something is Greenpeace, and they have been doing this for decades. And we see pictures here as a woman, a lawyer, an international lawyer in England, protesting against it, being imprisoned because of what she was doing. This is about climate. It says, get off climate. And by the way, in 1988, 89, I was teaching up in Northern California, and I wrote my first article on climate change. And as you can see, the title is Lower the Earth-Threatening Heat. And because the article appeared in the Chicago Tribune in Chicago, and it's a major newspaper, the moment this was published, 6 months later, it was reprinted, partly reprinted by the Wall Street Journal, and I found a letter reprimand on my desk. They were trying to fire me because I wrote this article. Fortunately, the administrator thought differently, and he was with me, and he said, just don't worry about it, and nothing happened. But nevertheless, it's just a symptom of the mentality of people being hooked up to a certain idea or a certain chemical or whatever it is, a cigarette or whatever, that this is this solution. There's no diversity, no difference. All these pictures that I have telling you part of the story. Here we have President Joe Biden at the United Nations conference in 2021 in Scotland, making his appeal and pretending to be the defender of climate, the defender of the earth, and so on. And here we have the Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping, doing exactly the same thing in the United Nations. And meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says, hey, the way you go, we're going to go beyond the 1.5 degree Celsius. And if we go above that, there will be catastrophic consequences. A catastrophe is, in Greek, it's a Greek word that means disaster, just complete desolation. And young people, when they discover some of what I'm telling you right now, they get all upset, all worked up, and they protest. But then after that, they have to go home and they continue to do what they do. But nevertheless, they said some great truths, like, for instance, you have all this prime ministers and presidents go to this international summits, and what do? They say blah, 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 blah. Then they don't make any promises. When they say, we're going to have this and this, nevertheless, unfortunately, they don't do it. And Guterres has the courage to tell them, hey, you're liars. In fact, he has put it in writing. And I quote him in the new book that I have been writing about this. Now, this is this year's Global Summit on Climate in Egypt. And here you have, again, young men and women say, stop funding fossil fuels. And guess what? In fact, we are still funding fossil fuels at the tune of almost $700 billion per year. Think of it. Knowing fully well that the burden of this stuff is causing global warming, we are still paying the fossil fuel companies to do what they have been doing. That is like we are suicidal, like we are insane and we don't know what we're doing. That's what it is. This little island in the Pacific, Tuvalu, is sinking. And the prime minister, he came up, he wrote a letter, and I got a copy of the letter, and I quote him verbatim in my new book. And he says, no, look, I'm sinking. The whole island is sinking. That is, the water is rising. And as you can see this picture, this building is going to be out the water. Maybe in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, who knows? But it's sinking. Nevertheless, few people give a damn what's happening to Tuvalu, because it's a tiny little island. And then this is a very dramatic picture from the 2022 meeting. It says, "Don't fail us." These are young men and women, and I wish them all the best, and I'm with them. But regrettably, I think we're going to fail them if we continue to do what we have been doing all along. China, as I said already, I have great hopes for China and a number of other things. Extract information and technology from your past. You have a millennia worth of history. You don't need anybody to tell you that you want to spray pesticides. You can grow rice without pesticides and keep the tremendous variety of rice you have and so on. The New York Times put this picture up and said, this is the picture of a still plant in China, which is supposed to emit the greatest amount of carbon gases on Earth. The rest of the pictures are pretty much continue the same story of the effects of high temperature. I have a couple of pictures from Greece, where I was born. And here you have the lower part of Greece. Peloponnesus is on fire in 2007, in the summer of 2007, August. You see the August 2007. And then 2 years later, again in August 2009, again on fire. And they do that intentional because of tourism. They want to create more hotels, more motels, more highways to attract more Europeans, more Africans, more Asians, or whatever, to spend their money because the country is bankrupt. So this is they call it the greatest tourism, the largest industry they have in Greece is tourism. So they are destroying the environment because of that. I am very much against it, and I think it's stupid. These are fires in the Amazon. This is the Amazon burning, protest against the Amazon. Here you have fires in Australia. And this is a picture that is unbelievable, the power of this picture. You can see you are in Borneo, Indonesia, and what do they do in Borneo and Indonesia? Just like in Brazil, they cut down the forest to grow plantations, to grow soybeans, to sell to the Europeans, to sell to the Americans, and to help with the wildlife. And here you have all these sisters with these baby animals trying to save them from extinction. Fires all everywhere. In California, we have had tremendous amount of fire. Everywhere. The smoke from the fires is absolutely dangerous. Here is a picture I took in San Francisco. I was walking and suddenly the gigantic bridge disappeared. And look at the picture. You can see the car, and then above it is the bridge, the gigantic bridge. It disappeared. Why? Because there was a fire, forest fire not far away from there, and the smoke had covered the whole atmosphere. And you can see the effect. This is it. And then, of course, the people who are concerned about all this, they say, okay, we go to solar and wind. And the way they created these monsters, these gigantic towers that they will wipe out any bird that gets even near them. They're indeed gigantic. Some of them are 150 meters tall. And it's just terror for wildlife. And there's an alternative to that. This picture shows you here in California, the Palm Springs. You can see on the upper part the windmills, and on the lower part the highways with countless number of automobiles. To construct a windmill is quite an operation in the environment. It's destructive. It's gigantic. And it's just, as I said, it's not friendly to the environment or to people or to anybody else. Here you are. Capitalism, yeah. Capitalism is the economic system that we all pretend all we have, including China. And capitalism is, these people say capitalism and extinction. And they certainly have a lot of weight to say. This woman says capitalism is the virus. Think of it. And this is another dramatic picture of this young woman say, hey, stop it, stop it. And finally, this is a dead goat in Africa and close to this tree. Planet over profit. That was the protest of these young men and women in this conference in Egypt. But then, of course, suddenly the Americans and the Europeans decided to join the Ukraine against Russia. And of course, a war is the greatest promoter of global warming because the machinery, the petroleum, and all these disasters and all these efforts to create energy and so on. So if you fight a war, you immediately turn away from what you should be doing, which is to get into clean energy, and you keep the dirty energy to kill people in the Ukraine and Russia. And I'm against it. The solution is, of course, the solar panels, and you see the solar panels over my house, and that was it. So I thank you, and I'm delighted if we have enough time to respond to your questions.
Awesome presentation, Eve. Thank you very much for taking the time, putting all this together. So please, any questions? Anyone? Unmute your microphone.
I have a question, so sorry if I jump in. My name is Tony. People know me as Geovox. I'm a supporter of the hydrogen economy. At university, it was one of the things I studied under my own steam. Found that because the hydrogen economy gives us not only electricity, but by using electrolysis to split water, when we recombine it through fuel cells, we get water back. So actually, the hydrogen economy can be a way of desalinating water and various other technologies that are being developed. My question to Eve is, do you believe that if we were to combine the Move Your Money movement, resurrected, and get people to move to ethical banks like Triodos Bank here in Europe, we can get enough funding to kickstart a massive investment avalanche in the hydrogen economy? If you look at hydrogen, I think it's called Hydrogen News. It's a website that has an awful lot of information. You'll see a lot of very large companies are signing up to hydrogen. Bosch, companies that size. So thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I must admit that I don't know very much about the hydrogen connection to global warming, but certainly if it does not emit bad stuff that warms the planet, I think that's okay. Yeah. But I agree, however, much more with your point that we need to have a massive, a kind of a very active and energetic protest against what the status quo with petroleum and natural gas and coal, and make the transition. Solar panels are the transition. If we put solar panels over everybody's home, factories, every parking lot, every mall, every space that is available, I think at least we would make a big of a difference. The other big difference, of course, would be to stop the war and focus and work together. Unless China and the United States, the two largest polluters on earth, get to work together, there's not much of a hope. And this is perhaps the apathy of the average person. They say, what can I do? Look at China. They know the politics. They see the contrast. They see the Cold War. They feel the Cold War, in fact. And they see the disaster that we see every day in the news. We have had all these fantastic destructions in the United States. In Florida, for instance, Hurricane Ian destroyed a lot of Florida. And yet, if you go to Florida today, they say there's no global warming. So it's a kind of a transcendental, almost a metaphysical transition you have to make to take word and say science is actually something we should follow. This is what the proof is. This is what the truth is. And unless we accept the truth, we are doomed.
It's a complicated business. Its damage is extensive, very complex, but we have to find a solution to this.